Okay, so now we're getting at towards the global assembly line, and we're going to look at the case of RCA, which is the Radio Corporation of America. Now, I've mentioned RCA a number of times, sometimes in the lecture discussions. I think I may have mentioned it even in the first lecture. RCA is really interesting because you can really trace its movement from one part of the world to another that will eventually give rise to what's called the global assembly line of the late 20th and early 21st century. So, RCA, again, stands for the Radio Corporation of America, and one of the key things that they made was television sets. Now, if we look at the next slide here, essentially what happened was RCA started out here in New Jersey. And what happened was they set up a plant, and it functioned fairly well for a significant period of time in the mid 20th century. But then eventually, workers in that plant had unionized, they became more militant and wanted higher wages, right? So the managers of RCA decided they didn't need all this industrial conflict, and they didn't want to deal with kind of the militancy of the unions that had emerged there. So they moved their plant to Indiana. And so the reason they moved to Indiana is that this was a cheaper labor market, right? This is the American Northeast. This is a more expensive place to live, right? Workers here expect more money. This is the kind of one of the industrial heartlands of the United States. When I talked about the Rust Belt, right? The industrial heartland of the United States, where most industrial companies existed up until the mid to late 20th century, was here. This is where it is. Right? So places like Chicago, Wisconsin, Michigan, the entire auto industry is here in Detroit. You've got a lot of industrial production here in Ohio. Of course, Homestead Steel, Pennsylvania was here, upstate New York. And of course, the beginning of American industry was here in Massachusetts. So by moving their operations from New Jersey to Indiana, they were betting on the fact that workers there would tolerate lower wages for a number of reasons. One, it's a lot cheaper to live in Indiana, the cost of living. It's a cheaper labor market. And there were no unions at the time in Indiana. So the workers there eventually start working for RCA, and it seems pretty good. They're making more money than they otherwise would. And this is often the key when these companies move into cheaper labor markets. They offer far less money than where they came from, but usually a little bit more money than what people in the new area are used to making, which allows them to attract a lot of workers, which they did initially. But of course, the same cycle repeats itself here in Indiana. These workers eventually start organizing. They start forming unions, and they want more wages. They want better healthcare. They want better benefits, all of these things. And then eventually RCA does the same thing. And so they move from Indiana to Tennessee, Memphis, Tennessee. And the specific reason they moved to Memphis, Tennessee, and into the South in general is most of the workers here were white. There were most of them here were probably Scotch-Irish. Here it was probably a mix of Italian, Irish, German, the kind of industrial working class of the urban cities of the great north, these northeastern cities in the United States. And here it's kind of Scotch-Irish, more rural workers. This is a much more rural economy, lower wages, that kind of thing. So here, their workforce is largely African-American. And the reason they do that is they move there, one, because the South is an even cheaper labor market than here. This is now the American South. And they bet that hiring African-American workers means it'll be even cheaper than if they hired white workers from the South. And at first, that turns out to be true, right? And again, the same process repeats itself. When they move into Tennessee, Memphis, Tennessee, they're offering higher wages than the workers there would be used to, but lower than the workers here were being paid, and much lower than the workers here were being paid. Now, this functions for quite a while. But again, the same thing happens, right? Workers here start to form unions. They start to ask for higher wages, more benefits, more control over production, all the things that working class movements usually ask for. So what happens then is RCA moves to here, and they move to Juarez, Mexico. And now they've basically gone from one labor market in New Jersey to a cheaper labor market in Indiana to a cheaper labor market in the American South. And now they're moving outside the United States to an even cheaper market in Mexico. In 1969, RCA moves its production here. Now this brings us to the next key thing to understand in the emergence of the global assembly line is the concept of a maquiladora. Now what a maquiladora is, it's a manufacturing operation where factories import certain material and equipment on a duty-free and tariff-free basis for assembling, processing, or manufacturing, and then export the assembled, processed, and or manufactured products, sometimes back to the raw materials country of origin. So the key way that this worked was that various corporations would set up along the U.S. border. And there was essentially a treaty between the United States and Mexico that created what is almost a kind of free trade zone along the border. What this did was allowed U.S. manufacturing operations to move to the U.S. border and have a lot of the product actually manufactured in Mexico to exploit the much cheaper labor market that existed in Mexico. They could pay their Mexican workers much lower wages than they were paying their workers in the United States. Sometimes it was even as bifurcated as the manufacturing operation is south of the US border, so where the thing is assembled, but then the offices were actually on the other side in the United States. So the white collar work was done on the US side of the border, and the blue collar work, for lack of a better word, or the actual production process was done on the Mexican side of the border. Now, what this did was essentially the raw materials for producing these televisions, in the case of RCA, much of it came from the United States. And the key to the treaty that created this Maquiladora system was that those goods could move duty-free without tariffs, so that you didn't have to pay tariffs and duty. This is the beginning of free trade, right? So first what you see is this happens along the US border. We forget that the United States shares the longest border between a quote-unquote first world country and a country of the global south. It's something that you don't often think about, that right? Mexico is considered part of the global south. The United States is considered part of the quote-unquote first world or the global north, or however you want to think of it. But it has this 1,500-mile border with Mexico, and American companies exploited this in the late 60s and the early 70s and 80s by setting up this Maquiladora system, whereby the raw materials to produce the television may have even come from the United States. It would pass across the Mexican border, duty-free and tariff-free. It would be manufactured in Mexico with much cheaper labor practices, much more exploitative labor practices, as we'll see in a minute. And then that finished television was exported back to the United States, and it could be produced much cheaper because RCA was exploiting cheaper workers in Mexico. To give you a sense of it, here's Juarez from the air. And you can see the differences between, say, the United States and Juarez. The country, the city just expands massively. You also see this in Tijuana as well. Which is the other kind of key area in the Maquiladora system. We can look here if we see just, here's examples of televisions being manufactured probably in the 1970s and the 1980s, and this is the beginning of it. So RCA is kind of one of the first companies to do it. And in fact, at one point, there were more televisions being produced just south of the US border than almost anywhere in the world. And this expands to other companies. If we look at other companies here, right, Johnson & Johnson, Foxconn, Lexmark, 3M, Alcoa, which makes steel, a lot of these companies set up a Maquiladora system. And in the next slide, you can look at the various labor forces. So the Maquiladora labor force by branch of industry. So if we look at the various industries in the United States, this shows you what percentage of the things that are produced in that industry operates under the Maquiladora system. So one of the biggest ones is garment and textile products, right? So 28%. Of that industry is essentially in the Maquiladora system. Another big one is, I believe, yes, electronics, electrical and electronic accessories also produced in this system. Now, this is the beginning of the global assembly line. What starts in the United States looking at to its much poorer neighbor to the south in Mexico to exploit those much cheaper labor markets now goes global after the 1970s and the 1980s. And what we will get is the globalization of production itself, where we get the economy that we have today. But the beginnings of this start in the late 1960s and the early 70s. So what we've covered today is the move from that kind of laissez-faire capitalism in the late 19th century, where liberalism is defined as keeping the state as an arm's length of capitalism, to capitalism and liberalism being redefined in the mid-20th century, with the rise of Fordism and the creation of new markets by integrating the working class into the consumptive aspect of capitalism, that the working class can now consume products that were once really the preserve of the middle class and above. They can consume the products they were producing, and Ford being the biggest example, where the workers making the cars can now afford to buy the cars, right? It led to a decrease in industrial conflict. And of course, the other thing that happened was because of the shocks of the First World War, the Great Depression, and the Second World War, the state now steps in as a much greater mover and actor in the capitalist economy. It has both legitimation functions by blunting these kind of rough edges of capitalism, making it more palatable for workers, and also functions in the realm of accumulation by directly getting involved in the economy to assist and handmaid in the accumulation of capital for private industry. And it does this in various ways: subsidies, seeking out new markets, tariffs, all these kinds of things. And then by the end of that, we get the US state rebuilds the capitalist economy in the 1940s and the 1950s that eventually will lead to the global assembly line by the 1970s and the 1980s. And as this is happening, by the late 1960s and the 1970s, there will be a crisis that emerges in capitalism where this kind of embedded liberalism, where liberalism gets redefined in the mid-20th century of much greater state intervention, a crisis emerges in the late 60s and the early 1970s, and people perceive that that new system of capitalism no longer works. And what we get is the rise of neoliberalism and a much greater intensification of the global assembly line, leading to what we have now as a kind of globalized production system. But before we go, there's one more video that I'm going to have you watch. It's just a mini 7-minute documentary that looks at the working lives of people who actually worked in these Maquiladoras companies along the Mexican border. And specifically, it's going to follow a few workers who worked in the manufacture of televisions, and just what their life is like, how they're exploited. On the one hand, why they started working there, the benefits and the cons of it. And then, of course, next week, the reading for next week, we're going to look at the rise of neoliberalism and as an ideology, possibly what could happen to neoliberalism in the next couple of decades, and we will leave it at that. I will also send out a message about the exam in the next couple of days, and I'll give some exam review next week as well. But be sure to watch the last video. All right, that's it for today.